In the spring of 1940, when Benito Mussolini declared war on France and Britain, the crowds in Rome roared as if the Roman Empire itself had returned. Fascist banners hung from marble balconies, trumpets echoed through the streets, and Il Duce stood on his balcony proclaiming that history was on Italy's side. The world saw a nation full of confidence and ambition, but behind that show of strength, Italy was already standing on the edge of collapse. The war Mussolini had just joined was not the one Italy was ready for. It was the one he needed to justify his dream. Mussolini believed that war was the ultimate proof of national power. Since the 1920s, he had promised Italians a new Roman Empire, one that would dominate the Mediterranean, Africa, and beyond. Italy, he said, was destined to rule again. Yet while his speeches filled the air with fire, Italy's factories remained cold. Its navy was short on fuel, its army short on modern weapons, and its air force, the Regia Aeronautica, still relied on outdated biplanes in a world already dominated by fast monoplane fighters. On paper, Mussolini commanded millions of men. In reality, only a fraction were equipped to fight a modern war. Inside the Palazzo Venezia, Italy's generals warned him that the country needed more time, at least until 1942, to rearm and modernize. Mussolini ignored them. He wanted glory now. He believed Hitler's victories in Poland and France meant the war would be over within months. If Italy joined late but still claimed victory, he would stand beside Hitler as an equal. That decision, made out of pride and fear of missing out, sealed Italy's fate. When Mussolini declared war on June 10, 1940, his generals didn't cheer. They sighed. They knew what he had just done, dragged a fragile, divided country into a total war it could not sustain. In truth, Italy had never been truly united behind fascism. Beneath the parades and propaganda, the nation was fractured. Its industrial north cities, like Turin and Milan, carried the weight of production. Its rural south remained poor and underdeveloped. Its colonial ambitions in Africa drained resources it didn't have. And while Hitler's Germany built tanks by the thousands, Italy's factories could barely produce a few dozen a month. The Regia Marina, Italy's navy, was impressive in size but had no aircraft carriers, and its ships were chronically short on fuel. Mussolini had created the image of a great power, not the reality of one. When war came, that illusion began to crumble almost immediately. Italy's first campaign against tiny, exhausted France was a humiliation. While the Germans smashed through French defenses in the north, Italian troops struggled to advance even a few kilometers across the Alps. Their equipment froze in the mountain cold, their tanks stalled on the icy slopes. By the time they finally crossed the border, France was already defeated by Germany. Mussolini had joined the war to prove Italy's power, but instead proved its weakness. Yet Hitler still needed him. Italy's geographic position was priceless. The peninsula divided the Mediterranean in half, threatening British supply routes to Egypt and the Middle East. Italy's colonies in Libya and East Africa could tie down Allied forces and stretch British resources thin. To Hitler, Italy didn't need to be strong. It just needed to exist. Every Italian soldier, every port, every bomb dropped by an Italian plane was one less German needed elsewhere. In that sense, Italy was useful. But in every battle that followed, its usefulness was paid for in blood and humiliation. In North Africa, Mussolini sent his army to invade Egypt in 1940. It was supposed to be a quick victory against a small British force. Instead, it became a disaster. The Italian army, poorly supplied, badly trained, and led by officers who still thought like men from the First World War, was crushed. In just weeks, the British counterattack, Operation Compass, captured over 130,000 Italian soldiers. Whole divisions surrendered without firing a shot. The same soldiers who had marched through Rome in triumph now sat in desert prison camps, abandoned by a regime that had promised them glory. When Hitler heard the news, he was furious, and yet he couldn't let Italy fall. The Mediterranean mattered too much. So, the German Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, was sent to save Mussolini's army. That rescue was the first of many. From Greece to Tunisia, Germany found itself fighting not only its enemies, but also the failures of its ally. And still, Mussolini kept pretending that Italy stood equal beside the Reich. He gave speeches claiming victory, while German troops cleaned up his mess. The illusion of power became the theater of delusion. Back in Italy, ordinary people began to see the truth. They watched their sons go off to war with rifles from 1918 and uniforms that fell apart in the rain. They heard the radio broadcasts bragging about victories that never happened, and they began to ask the question Mussolini feared most: was this really worth it? By late 1941, as Germany turned east toward Russia and the United States entered the war, Italy's weakness was no longer a secret. Its economy was exhausted. Its morale was collapsing. Its armies were trapped in wars they could no longer win. Mussolini's speeches had promised destiny, but destiny had turned into survival. Italy had become a burden the Axis could barely carry. But still, the image persisted. In Berlin, Hitler continued to call Mussolini his brother in arms. In Rome, the propaganda machines kept rolling. The statues, the marches, the slogans, all of it designed to hide the simple truth. Italy was powerful in myth, but weak in reality, and Mussolini knew it. As his empire began to crumble, he once told his generals, "We are not fascists, we are Italians." Too human, too soft, too sentimental. He was right about one thing. Italy's story in World War II was not one of villains or heroes, but of ordinary people trapped inside a fantasy of greatness they never asked for. And as the war dragged on, that fantasy would collapse under the weight of its own lies. The illusion of power was over. What came next would reveal just how fragile Mussolini's empire really was. When Mussolini looked at the map of Africa, he didn't see deserts or borders. He saw destiny. He dreamed of reviving the Mare Nostrum, RC, the ancient Roman name for the Mediterranean. In his vision, Libya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia would form the heart of a new Italian empire stretching from the Sahara to the Indian Ocean. But the empire he imagined was built not on power, but on propaganda, and like sand beneath a collapsing wall, it would soon crumble under the weight of reality. By 1940, Italy already controlled large colonial territories in North and East Africa. Yet those conquests had drained more resources than they provided. Libya's desert produced almost nothing. Ethiopia, conquered only 4 years earlier, after a brutal campaign of mustard gas and bombings, was still unstable and rebellious. The infrastructure was primitive. Roads, factories, supply lines, everything Mussolini's empire needed to sustain a modern war was missing. But in Rome, none of that mattered. The parades, the statues, the radio broadcasts spoke of imperial triumph. Fascism thrived on illusion, not logistics. When Mussolini joined the war, his first instinct was to strike where he thought Italy could win easily: North Africa and Greece. The logic was simple. Britain was distracted by Germany, and Mussolini wanted his own victories before the war ended. But the result was catastrophic. In North Africa, the Italian army that crossed into Egypt in 1940 was already starving. Its tanks were underpowered and outdated. Its trucks broke down in the sand. Its soldiers had no desert training, no air cover, and often no will to fight. Within weeks, British and Commonwealth forces, led by General O'Connor, counterattacked, capturing thousands of Italian soldiers. Entire divisions surrendered intact. For Mussolini, it was more than a military defeat. It was a humiliation. The new Roman Empire had fallen apart in the very desert it had dreamed of ruling. Then came Greece. In October 1940, Mussolini, jealous of Hitler's victories, launched a surprise invasion of Greece from Albania. He thought it would take 2 weeks. It took 6 months and ended in disaster. The Greek army, outnumbered but determined, pushed the Italians back into Albania. Italian casualties mounted, and their morale collapsed. Hitler was forced to intervene again, sending German troops to rescue his ally. Once more, Mussolini's pride had become Hitler's burden. For the German high command, the lesson was clear: Italy could not be trusted to fight alone. But for Hitler, abandoning Mussolini was impossible. The Mediterranean was strategically vital. Control of the sea meant control of oil, trade, and the southern flank of Europe. Italy's ports, its airfields, its long coastline, all were essential to Germany's war machine. So, Even as he mocked Mussolini in private, Hitler kept sending reinforcements, equipment, and fuel to keep Italy's war going. In Berlin, officers called it Die Italienisch Last, the Italian burden. But Hitler understood something that few others did. Mussolini's weakness was useful. A dependent Italy was an Italy he could control. Inside Italy itself, the war was devouring everything. By 1941, food shortages had become common. Rationing began. Factories worked without raw materials. The once proud fascist youth organizations sent boys to the front who barely knew how to hold a rifle. The industrial North was overworked. The agricultural South starved. The illusion of unity, one of fascism's favorite myths, began to break. Propaganda could no longer hide the truth. Soldiers returning from Africa brought home stories of chaos, poor leadership, and despair. Mothers whispered that their sons had been abandoned by generals who lived in luxury, while troops marched barefoot through the desert. In Rome, the police reported a dangerous new phenomenon: silence. Crowds no longer cheered Mussolini's speeches. They listened and said nothing. Meanwhile, the empire was dying piece by piece. In early 1941, British forces advanced through East Africa. Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia fell one after another. By the end of the year, Italy's dream of an African empire was gone. The colonies Mussolini had claimed as proof of fascist greatness now existed only in maps and memories. Yet, paradoxically, even in defeat, Italy remained indispensable to Germany. The Luftwaffe used Italian airfields to strike British convoys. The Kriegsmarine relied on Italian ports for submarines and supply bases. The Axis occupation of the Balkans depended on Italy's armies weak, but numerous. Hitler might have called Mussolini a small-time Caesar, but without Italy's geography, his Mediterranean strategy would have collapsed. That strange duality defined Italy's entire war: militarily weak, strategically vital, a partner and a liability, all at once. It was a relationship built not on equality, but on dependence and deception. Mussolini needed Hitler's victories to survive politically. Hitler needed Mussolini's territory to survive strategically. Each man believed he was using the other, and both were right. But there was one truth neither could admit. Italy's failures were no longer temporary. They were structural. Its weapons industry could not compete. Its fuel reserves were almost gone. Its population was exhausted. The myth of fascist modernity had met the reality of 20th century warfare and lost. By 1942, as American factories flooded the skies with planes and the seas with ships, Mussolini's dream of empire was finished. But he didn't stop. Pride kept him going. Even when he knew the war was lost, he refused to admit it. He still gave speeches about destiny, still invoked the glory of Rome, still claimed that fascism would triumph over the decadent democracies. In private, though, Mussolini was a broken man. His letters revealed doubts, despair, even fear. He once wrote to his mistress, Clara Pedici, "The Germans are the war. We are only their shadow." It was the closest he ever came to admitting defeat. The empire he had built on promises and illusions was now collapsing around him. Italian soldiers were dying on foreign soil for a dream that no longer existed. And as the Allies turned their attention to Sicily and the Italian mainland, Mussolini's regime would soon face its ultimate reckoning. The empire was gone. The illusion of greatness was gone. All that remained was a country on the verge of invasion and a dictator running out of lies to tell. By 1943, Mussolini's empire was dying faster than he could invent new victories. His grand speeches still echoed across Rome, but his words no longer reached the hearts of the people. Italy was starving, its factories silent, its soldiers broken and scattered across continents. The dream of a new Roman Empire had turned into a nightmare of occupation, defeat, and betrayal. For the first time since his rise to power, Mussolini was surrounded not by cheers, but by silence. When the Allies landed in North Africa in late 1942, the balance of the war shifted forever. Operation Torch brought American and British forces into the Mediterranean, and Italy became the next target. The Allies knew that Italy was the weak link of the Axis. They had seen it in Greece, in Egypt, in Libya. The Italian army could no longer fight effectively without German support. Hitler knew it too, but for him, Italy was too valuable to abandon. He ordered Rommel to withdraw what was left of the Afrika Korps back toward Tunisia. From there, the Germans would make their stand, buying time to prepare for the inevitable, the invasion of Europe from the south. For Mussolini, every retreat was another crack in his illusion of control. The propaganda films stopped showing victories and began showing sacrifices. The newsreels replaced triumphal marches with funerals. He blamed Germany for abandoning him, blamed the weather, the terrain, even fate. But deep inside, he knew the truth. Italy had never been ready for this war. His generals had told him so 3 years earlier, when it still might have mattered. Now it was too late. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. It was the first step in their plan to break the Axis from within, and they knew where to strike. They called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe, but what they found was chaos. German troops fought fiercely, but Italian soldiers deserted in the thousands. Entire units vanished. Civilians welcomed the Allies with bread and wine. For many Italians, the war was no longer about Hitler or Mussolini, it was about survival. On July 25th, the Grand Council of Fascism met in Rome for the last time. After a tense and bitter session, Mussolini's own party voted to remove him from power. The man who had once ruled Italy with iron fists and fiery speeches was arrested the next day. As his motorcade drove away, people watched from their windows, not in mourning, but in disbelief. The dictator who had promised eternal glory had fallen without a fight. In his place, King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who immediately began secret negotiations with the Allies. On September 8, 1943, Italy officially surrendered. The announcement shocked the world and enraged Hitler. For him, Italy's betrayal was personal. Within hours, German forces launched Operation Axe, occupying the entire Italian peninsula. Overnight, the country that had been Hitler's ally became his prisoner. The Italian army, unprepared and leaderless, disintegrated. German troops surrounded their positions and gave them a choice: join us or die. Thousands of Italian soldiers who refused were executed or deported to labor camps. The once proud Regio Esercito was gone. Italy had ceased to exist as a unified nation. The country split in two, the north controlled by the Nazis and Mussolini's puppet regime, the south under Allied control. When German paratroopers rescued Mussolini from captivity at Gran Sasso in a daring raid, he believed, for a brief moment, that his destiny had returned. Hitler installed him as the head of the Italian Social Republic, a shadow government based in Salo. But this was no empire. It was a cage. Mussolini ruled nothing. His armies were German-controlled, his officials German-supervised. The man who once dreamed of reviving Rome now signed orders written in Berlin. Meanwhile, the Italian people turned against him completely. Resistance movements grew in every city, every mountain, every factory. The Partigiani, Italian partisans, fought both the Germans and Mussolini's fascists in a brutal civil war. Villages were burned, civilians executed, and entire towns wiped out in retaliation. The country that had once united under fascism was now tearing itself apart. By 1944, Italy had become one of the most dangerous places in Europe, not for soldiers, but for civilians. Bombings by the Allies flattened cities, German reprisals filled mass graves, and in the middle of it all, Mussolini, trapped in his villa at Lake Garda, wrote letters to Hitler filled with desperation. "Germany will fight to the last," he wrote. "Italy cannot." He knew it was over. He knew he had led his country into ruin. As Allied forces advanced north, Mussolini's last loyalists began to abandon him. His speeches became hollow whispers, his eyes empty. He had lost his army, his people, his dream. All that remained was his fear of being captured alive. On April 25, 1945, he fled Milan, disguised in a German uniform, hoping to escape into Switzerland. He never made it. 2 days later, Italian partisans intercepted his convoy near the village of Dongo. They recognized him immediately. The man who had once ruled an empire now stood powerless before farmers with rifles. On April 28th, Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were executed. Their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down in a public square. The people who once saluted him now spat on him. The illusion of empire had ended in humiliation and blood. For Germany, Mussolini's fall was another disaster in a collapsing world. The Axis had lost its southern flank. The Mediterranean was open to the Allies. Hitler's dream of a fortress Europe was crumbling from within. The very ally he had once considered a burden had now become his downfall. For Italy, the end of the war brought no victory, only devastation. Cities lay in ruins, industries destroyed, millions displaced. But among the rubble, a new Italy began to emerge, one free of fascism, born not from conquest, but from survival. In the end, Mussolini's greatest failure wasn't military. It was moral. He had built an empire on lies, on pride, and on fear, and when the truth came, it consumed him. His fall was not just the fall of a dictator, but the fall of an illusion that had haunted an entire nation. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, the war did not end. It changed shape. What had once been a conflict between nations became a war within a nation. Families divided. Neighbors became enemies. Soldiers who had once fought under the same flag now hunted each other through the ruins of their homeland. Italy, exhausted and broken, began to devour itself. The surrender, announced by radio on September 8, 1943, was meant to bring peace. But instead, it unleashed chaos. The king had fled south to Allied territory, leaving the country without leadership. Italian generals received no orders, only confusion. Some units tried to join the Allies. Others surrendered to the Germans. Many were massacred where they stood. Overnight, 800,000 Italian soldiers were captured and sent to German labor camps. The same army that had fought in the name of Mussolini now became slaves in the factories of the Reich. In the north, the Germans moved fast. Hitler could not allow Italy to collapse completely, not because he trusted Mussolini, but because he needed Italy's geography. The Alps, the Po Valley, the ports of Genoa and Trieste, all were essential to defend southern Europe. So the Wehrmacht occupied the entire peninsula, disarming Italian troops, executing officers, and turning the country into a military fortress. The Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet regime, was declared in the small town of Salo. It was fascism's last ghost, a government without power, ruling a country already under German control. But outside Salo, something was happening that Mussolini could not control. Across the countryside, small bands of fighters began to organize. They called themselves partigiani, partisans. Students, workers, peasants, former soldiers, united not by ideology, but by rage. They had seen their homes bombed, their brothers deported, their villages burned. They wanted revenge, and they wanted freedom. The resistance was not born from politics. It was born from hunger and shame. For years, Mussolini had promised Italians that they were a superior race, heirs to Rome's glory. Now they were beggars in their own streets, watched by German patrols, ordered around by their former leaders. Every day, the occupiers grew more brutal. Villages suspected of hiding partisans were wiped out. Civilians were hanged in town squares as warnings. Entire communities were burned to the ground. In the mountains of Piedmont, in Tuscany, in Emilia-Romagna, the partisans struck back. They sabotaged rail lines, ambushed convoys, and assassinated fascist officials. For every attack, the Germans responded with terror. The massacre at Sant'Anna di Stazzema left hundreds of civilians dead, women, children, the elderly. In Marzabotto, the SS killed nearly 800 people in 3 days. The war had turned personal. It was no longer about flags or borders. It was about survival and vengeance. Meanwhile, in the south, the Allies advanced slowly up the peninsula. The fighting was brutal. The Germans, skilled in mountain warfare, turned every valley and river into a fortress. Battles like Monte Cassino, fought under the shadow of a 1,000-year-old monastery, became symbols of Italy's agony. The Allies bombed entire cities to break German defenses. Naples, Rome, Florence, each paid a terrible price. By the time the Allies reached Rome in June 1944, much of Italy lay in ruins. But liberation did not mean unity. The resistance in the north and the royal government in the south did not trust each other. The partisans saw the monarchy as complicit in fascism. The king saw the partisans as dangerous communists. While the Germans and fascists were retreating, a new battle was already forming, one for the soul of Italy itself. Inside the puppet republic of Salo, Mussolini lived in a state of delusion. He still gave orders, still signed decrees, but they meant nothing. Every decision was vetted by the Germans. His ministers argued, his generals deserted, his speeches were ignored. Yet he refused to flee. He told his mistress, Clara Pedici, "They may kill me, but they will never kill the idea of Mussolini." But even that idea was dying. The war dragged on, and with it came starvation. Cities like Milan and Turin were filled with refugees, their faces hollow, their eyes empty. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Allied bombings fell almost daily, and every explosion felt like a heartbeat of a dying nation. In the factories, the workers went on strike, not for wages, but for dignity. No more war, they wrote on the walls. No more fascism. By 1945, the partisans controlled large parts of northern Italy. They had grown from scattered bands into a coordinated movement of tens of thousands. Their flags flew over villages once loyal to the regime. Their radio broadcasts called for uprising, and in April of that year, they finally received their moment. The German front collapsed. The Allies broke through in the Po Valley. The fascist state of Salo was finished. As the Germans fled, so did Mussolini. His dream of empire had ended in rubble and betrayal. The men who had once saluted him now tore off their uniforms and vanished into the crowd. The war was ending, but Italy's wounds were only beginning. For years to come, the nation would struggle to understand what it had become, how it had gone from empire to occupation, from pride to ruin. Italy had been both useful and weak. Useful to Hitler's ambitions, weak to its own delusions. And when the smoke cleared, the cost of that weakness was measured not in lost battles, but in lost souls. Over 450,000 Italians had died, soldiers, civilians, partisans, and children. But from that suffering, something new would emerge, a country forced to confront the lies it had once believed. The old Italy had died, but perhaps, in its ashes, a new one was ready to be born. After Italy's surrender in 1943, the German army didn't just occupy the country, it devoured it. What had once been a proud Axis ally became a battlefield, a colony, and a graveyard, all at once. For 2 years, Italy paid the price of loyalty, not to its people, but to a dictator and an ideology that refused to die. When Hitler learned that Mussolini had been arrested, his rage was volcanic. To him, loyalty was sacred, and betrayal was unforgivable. Within hours, German divisions flooded across the Alps. Soldiers who had fought beside Italians now turned their guns on them. The Wehrmacht disarmed entire units, executed officers, and seized ports, airfields, and communication lines. It was swift, brutal, and precise, the kind of efficiency only Germany still possessed in the 4th year of a collapsing war. But this occupation wasn't just military, it was psychological. Hitler wanted Italy not only under his control, but humiliated. The Italian Social Republic, created under Mussolini's reluctant leadership, was designed to look like a rebirth of fascism. In truth, it was a puppet theater. Every order came from Berlin. Every minister answered to a German general. Mussolini himself, pale and exhausted, was no longer the Duce of 1936. He was a ghost in his own empire, signing papers that meant nothing and waiting for the end he knew was coming. Meanwhile, for ordinary Italians, liberation had only brought new chains. The Germans seized factories, farms, and food supplies. Towns that resisted were burned to the ground. In the north, slave labor camps appeared, Italians forced to work for the Reich's war machine. The same men who once marched under the fascist flag now shoveled coal in German factories or built fortifications against the Allies. And yet, even in this nightmare, some Italians remained loyal, not to Hitler, but to Mussolini. Fanatical fascists, convinced that surrender was treason, fought under the black banner of the Repubblica Social Italiana. They formed militias, hunted partisans, and carried out executions in Mussolini's name. They were called Brigate Neri, the Black Brigades, and their cruelty shocked even the Germans. For them, loyalty had become an obsession, a way to cling to meaning in a world collapsing around them. One of those brigades, operating near Turin, executed 80 civilians in a single night. Their crime? Helping partisans. In Verona, fascist courts condemned former ministers and officers who had dared to question Mussolini's leadership. Among them was his own son-in-law, Galasso Ciano. His execution by firing squad in 1944 marked the end of any illusion that loyalty meant safety. Under fascism, loyalty was only rewarded with death. While the fascists fought their hopeless war in the north, the Allies advanced from the south, inch by inch, hill by hill. The campaign was a nightmare of mud, mountains, and endless blood. The Germans fought fiercely, using Italy's geography to their advantage. Every river, a barrier; every village, a fortress. At Monte Cassino, the Allies bombed one of Europe's oldest monasteries to rubble, believing German troops were hiding inside. The destruction shocked the world. But the Germans had been waiting outside, using the ruins as cover. Thousands died for a few miles of ground. Through it all, the Italian civilians suffered the most. Every front passed through their homes, every army demanded their food, every ideology claimed their lives. In the winter of 1944, famine and disease spread across the country. Cities like Florence and Bologna became ghost towns. The once proud heart of Europe was now a landscape of ruins, filled with orphans, widows, and refugees. But in the shadows, a different kind of loyalty was rising. Loyalty to the idea of freedom. The partisans had grown stronger, better armed, and more organized. Allied support began to flow into the mountains. Weapons, radios, supplies. The resistance was no longer a collection of scattered bands. It was now an army, the army of a new Italy. They fought under many flags: communists, monarchists, liberals. But in the chaos of war, one goal united them all: to drive out the Germans and end fascism forever. By early 1945, the German occupation was crumbling. The Allies had crossed the Po River, and the partisan uprising exploded across northern Italy. Factories revolted. Workers took up arms. Towns declared themselves liberated. The Black Brigades tried to fight back, but were overwhelmed. For the first time in years, the Italian people, not the fascists, not the Germans, controlled their own fate. And then came the reckoning. The partisans hunted fascist officials, judges, and collaborators. Many were tried, others were executed on the spot. In Milan, in Turin, in Genoa, vengeance came fast and without mercy. It was not justice, it was release. After years of terror, the rage of a nation poured into the streets. Mussolini, fleeing north toward the Swiss border, knew it was over. His letters in those last days are desperate, almost poetic in their despair. "The world has abandoned me," he wrote. "Even the Germans see me as a burden." He was right. Hitler had already stopped answering his messages. The Duce had become irrelevant even to his master. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were captured and executed by partisans. The man who once demanded worship now swung from a metal beam in Milan, his body riddled with bullets, his eyes open, staring into nothing. Around him, the crowd screamed, cheered, spat, and wept, not out of hatred alone, but out of years of humiliation, hunger, and loss. It was the price of loyalty, the price of following an illusion until it consumed everything. For the Allies, Italy was finally liberated, but the land they walked on was soaked in blood, not only from battle, but from betrayal. Italy had fought for both sides, lost on both sides, and in the end, had to rebuild from ashes. What remained of Mussolini's empire was nothing but ruins and memories. The monuments he built still stood, carved in stone in arrogance, but the people who once believed in him had vanished or changed sides. The empire that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted barely 2 decades. The war had turned Italy from an aggressor into a victim, from a kingdom into a republic, from a symbol of pride into a lesson in tragedy. and perhaps that was its final contribution to history, a warning of what happens when loyalty replaces reason, and when pride blinds a nation to the truth of its own weakness. The war was over, but Italy was not free, not yet. The smoke of battle had cleared, but the air still carried the smell of death and the echo of betrayal. Cities lay in ruins, railways shattered, fields scorched. The people wandered through the rubble like ghosts, searching for food, for shelter, for meaning. For a country that had once dreamed of empire, there was nothing left but dust. Rome, the eternal city, stood scarred but unbroken. Its monuments had survived bombings that flattened entire neighborhoods. The Colosseum still watched silently as soldiers marched through its shadows, first Germans, then Americans. In the streets, people whispered a new word they hadn't dared to speak for 20 years, freedom. But freedom, they discovered, was not the same as peace. The fall of Mussolini had not ended Italy's suffering. The North was still burning with vengeance. Fascist loyalists were hunted, beaten, and executed. In towns like Turin and Milan, corpses hung from lampposts, a grim mirror of Mussolini's own fate. For every partisan who celebrated liberation, there was a mother who mourned a son lost to both sides. The war had not just divided Italy, it had poisoned it. In the months that followed, Allied soldiers flooded into the country. To many Italians, they were saviors. To others, they were just new occupiers. American trucks rolled through villages that had nothing left to give. Children begged for chocolate and cigarettes, while their parents bartered family heirlooms for bread. Italy, once proud and defiant, was now a land of survivors, a people too tired to hate, too hungry to hope. But among the ruins, something extraordinary began to happen. For the first time in decades, Italians started to speak without fear. Newspapers reappeared. Political parties emerged from hiding: liberals, monarchists, communists, Catholics. In cafes and classrooms, people debated what kind of nation Italy should become. Should they restore the monarchy that had betrayed them, or build a republic born from the ashes of fascism? The answer came on June 2nd, 1946. For the first time in its history, the Italian people voted freely. More than 24 million citizens cast their ballots in a national referendum. When the results were announced, the monarchy was abolished. The king who had fled in 1943 now fled again into exile. Italy was reborn as a republic. The new republic, however, was not built on glory. It was built on loss. The war had taken everything: industry, infrastructure, pride. Nearly 500,000 Italians were dead. Millions more were displaced. Entire regions were starving. The American Marshall Plan would later help rebuild the economy, but in 1946, that hope was still far away. The empire Mussolini had once promised had disintegrated completely. Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia were gone. Albania and Ethiopia, once symbols of Italian ambition, were now reminders of its arrogance. The colonies that had made Mussolini dream of being Caesar now existed only as names on fading maps. And yet, perhaps this was necessary, because for the first time in centuries, Italy had to look inward instead of outward. The illusion of empire was gone, but what replaced it was something more honest. A country not defined by conquest, but by survival. Not by pride, but by endurance. In those years, Italian society transformed quietly but profoundly. The Catholic Church regained influence, guiding a nation desperate for moral grounding. The working class, inspired by years of resistance, demanded rights and representation. Artists, filmmakers, and writers began telling the truth that propaganda had buried the truth about war, poverty, and the human cost of ambition. From this pain came a new identity. The world would soon see it in the films of neorealism, stories like Rome, Open City, and Bicycle Thieves. They didn't show heroes or soldiers. They showed ordinary people, broken and beautiful, trying to rebuild their lives from the ruins. For the first time, Italy was telling the world not who it wanted to be, but who it really was. Meanwhile, in the north, the factories of Milan and Turin roared back to life. The same industrial power that had once built weapons now produced cars, steel, and machinery. The name Fiat became a symbol of rebirth. The same hands that had forged bullets now built engines. The same railways that had carried troops now carried workers. Slowly, painfully, Italy began to move again. But ghosts lingered everywhere. In the quiet villages, unmarked graves held the bodies of fascists and partisans alike. No one dared to ask who had been right, who had been wrong. Everyone had lost something. And when night fell, the memories returned. The sound of sirens, the glow of burning cities, the silence after the bombs. Historians would later call it the Italian paradox. A country that had joined the war for glory ended it in shame, yet somehow found its soul in the process. The Italy that emerged from the ruins was no longer a tool of dictators or empires. It was a nation that understood fragility and therefore understood peace. The Allies, too, saw value in this rebirth. The Cold War was beginning, and Italy's position at the crossroads of Europe and the Mediterranean made it strategically essential. Once again, geography made Italy useful. But this time, usefulness didn't come from armies or conquests. It came from politics, from stability, from being the bridge between East and West. In less than a decade, Italy went from fascist empire to democratic republic, a transformation born not from strength, but from weakness. The weakness that had doomed Mussolini's war became the humility that saved his country. And perhaps that is the irony of Italy's story. Its greatest contribution to history was not the power it once claimed, but the lesson it learned too late, that no empire built on pride can last, and no nation built on lies can survive. In the end, the ruins were not the end at all. They were the beginning. The guns of World War II went silent in 1945, but in Italy, the echoes would last for generations. The ruins were rebuilt, the wounds healed on the surface, yet beneath it all, a question remained. How did a nation that dreamed of empire end up broken by its own ambitions? The answer, perhaps, lies not in what Italy lost, but in what it believed. Mussolini had convinced millions that destiny favored the bold, that willpower could rewrite history, that the Empire of Rome could rise again. And for a moment, it almost seemed true. The parades, the uniforms, the speeches, they gave Italians the illusion of power. But power built on illusion can only last until reality arrives. That reality came crashing down in the snows of Russia, the deserts of North Africa, the mountains of Greece. Every campaign revealed the same truth. Courage was not enough without preparation. Pride was not enough without strength. Mussolini's Italy had entered a world of machines with the dreams of a poet and the weapons of a museum. The irony is that Italy's usefulness to Germany came from its geography, not its greatness. The Mediterranean ports, the Alpine passes, the position between Africa and Europe, these were valuable. But the Italian army, navy, and air force were stretched thin, under-equipped, and poorly led. Even Hitler, his supposed ally, often treated Mussolini with quiet contempt, calling him the weakest link in the chain. But weakness has many faces. It wasn't just military. It was moral. Mussolini's fascism demanded absolute loyalty and punished doubt, but it never built unity. Italians fought for him, against him, beside him, sometimes all in the same war. The result was not a nation at war, but a nation divided, confused, and eventually conquered by its own contradictions. And yet, from that chaos, something profound emerged. When the war ended, Italy was forced to confront itself, not as a dream of empire, but as a country of people. The farmers of Sicily, the workers of Milan, the priests, the soldiers, the mothers who buried sons on both sides, they became the foundation of a new Italy. Not glorious, not invincible, but real. The first years after the war were years of silence. No one wanted to talk about who was fascist, who was partisan, who had collaborated. The guilt was collective. Entire towns had lived under Mussolini's shadow for 2 decades. Some had resisted, others had looked away. But gradually, the silence broke, not with speeches, but with stories. Writers began to tell what they had seen. Films began to show what they had lost. Roberto Rossellini's Rome, Open City, showed the brutality of occupation and the courage of resistance. Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves captured the despair of poverty and the dignity of survival. These stories, born from the ashes, became the conscience of a nation. while Germany carried the burden of guilt and Japan rebuilt behind American protection. Italy did something quieter. It remembered. It remembered the hunger, the bombings, the empty promises. It remembered the danger of believing in men who spoke too loudly, who promised too much. And that memory became its armor. By the 1950s, Italy had transformed again, from ruins to factories, from famine to fashion. The same creativity that once built fascist propaganda now built cars, art, and cinema. Fiat, Ferrari, Vespa, symbols of life replacing the symbols of war. The Italian Renaissance had been reborn, not in palaces or battlefields, but in workshops and studios. But the shadow of the war never vanished completely. In every Italian city, there are memorials with names, soldiers, civilians, partisans. In the north, small plaques still mark the places where people were executed during the occupation. Each one tells a story. Each one whispers the same warning, never again. For historians, Italy's experience in World War II became a paradox. A nation that began as aggressor and ended as victim. That fought beside the Nazis, but helped end their rule. That was both useful and weak. Yet, that paradox is what makes Italy's story universal. Because it is not just about war, it is about humanity. It is about how ordinary people become part of extraordinary lives. How faith in one man can blind a nation. How courage can return only when the illusion dies. And in that sense, Italy's journey was not failure, it was redemption. The weakness that once doomed it became the humility that rebuilt it. The same hands that saluted Mussolini later raised the Italian flag of a republic. The same land that once bred propaganda gave birth to art that changed world cinema forever. When historians look back at Italy in World War II, they often measure it in numbers. The divisions lost, the ships sunk, the cities destroyed. But perhaps the true measure lies elsewhere in what the war taught a people about themselves. That pride without conscience is poison. That loyalty without truth is slavery. That greatness, real greatness, begins only when a nation stops pretending it already has it. The story of Italy's weakness is, in truth, the story of its strength. Because from defeat came clarity. From humiliation came wisdom. And from ruins came a people who would never again follow the path of blind obedience. When Mussolini once stood before the crowds and declared, "History will call us great," he was right, but not in the way he imagined. History remembered Italy not for its conquests, but for its rebirth. And that is the lesson of a lost empire. Sometimes, the only way to find your soul is to lose your illusions first.